On the 6th of March, 1943, George Patton took command of the United States Second Army. Within less than an hour of arriving, he understood everything. The soldiers of the Second Army did not salute, and they wore their uniforms however they pleased. The headquarters was stuck deep in a canyon, miles from the front line, dug in like a unit expecting to lose. 3 weeks earlier, this very unit had been crushed by the German army at the Kasserine Pass, with soldiers abandoning their rifles and scattering in all directions. Discipline was not just lax, it was gone. Patton did not bother with maps or studying the enemy. He was certain the root cause of the problem was not the Germans, but the rotten spirit inside his own troops. That very morning, Patton got to work. He ordered the mess halls to close promptly at 7:30, and any soldier or officer who arrived late would go hungry. Then an order spread through every tent. Helmet chin straps must be fastened at all times. And Patton's all times meant whether you were in the latrine or on the front line. The rule was exactly the same. Neckties had to be tied, leggings tightened, vehicles cleaned. Any loosened chin strap carried a fine of $25, equivalent to half a private's monthly pay. This was Patton's first move taking over a defeated army. Not a battle plan. A fine on a chin strap, charging a broken unit the price of half a month's pay. Patton firmly believed that a man who looked broken was truly broken, and weakness, no matter how it showed, was the one thing he could never tolerate. 17 days later, this very unit that had fled at Kasserine stood against the toughest German armored division left in Tunisia, and held the line. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. Those assigned to defend the Kasserine line had spent the weeks before the war underground, tunneling for a general who never once came to the front. A company of the 19th Engineers was pulled from working on fortifying the pass and sent 70 miles east of the front, near Tebessa in Tunisia, to carve 2 long tunnels into a rocky canyon wall. On the map, that was a headquarters. For the soldiers digging stone, it was known as Lloyd's Last Refuge. Lloyd was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the United States Second Army, a man who almost never went out to see the war himself. Fredendall hid in the rocks, directing the entire army by radio using a code only he understood. Infantry was walking soldiers, artillery was little water guns. Even standard map coordinates were replaced with riddles. One position was the place that starts with C. Officers under him wasted hours decoding his messages while the Germans advanced. He spread the divisions too thinly to support each other and ignored advice from officers who had actually scouted the terrain. He gave them no air cover. Meanwhile, he stayed safely in the tunnels. On the 14th of February, German armored forces with 140 tanks charged through the Faid Pass and smashed into the scattered American positions, starting the Battle of Sidi Bou Zid. Among the captured officers in the following days was a Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, Patton's son-in-law. In less than a week, the Second Army had retreated nearly 50 miles with thousands killed, wounded, or captured, leaving equipment scattered along the roads. The engineers who had carved Fredendall's tunnels were rushed forward to plug gaps at the mountain pass. Many of them had not even completed rifle training before deployment. We often imagine a defeat as the moment the enemy turns out stronger than expected. The account of Kasserine Pass shows the opposite. The Germans were not giants. It was the Second Army, taught by 70 miles of rocky terrain and a commander who would not even show his face, a lesson. Surviving depends on staying further from the enemy, and a general who kept himself 70 miles from the front line was a general no one would defend. Eisenhower had seen enough. On the 5th of March, he flew to Tebessa and relieved Fredendall, disguising the dismissal as a routine transfer to save him some face. Armored Commander Ernest Harmon, who had barely managed to stabilize the front in the worst moments, had already told Eisenhower the truth. Fredendall was worthless. Someone asked Harmon to take command of the army himself. He refused, unwilling to step into a position he had just advised should be taken away. Eisenhower then asked Omar Bradley, who had visited all the divisions, for his opinion. Bradley's answer was blunt. There was not a single division commander who trusted Fredendall, so Eisenhower named Patton. He pulled Patton from the war planning room in Morocco. By then, Patton was already preparing for the invasion of Sicily, and handed him the broken army with only one instruction: be ready to start fighting within 10 days. Bradley came along as deputy commander, placed there by Eisenhower as his eyes within the headquarters. Patton's contempt for Fredendall went back a long way, ever since they had both been division commanders at Fort Benning in 1941. On the day he officially took command, he was unusually kind to the man he replaced. That evening, he wrote to his wife Beatrice that Fredendall was a good man and largely a victim of circumstances. But after touring the front for a week, that sympathy burned away. "I see no reason for Fredendall to live," he wrote later. "I have never seen such poor order and discipline." What Patton saw in his first days was not an enemy that outmatched his men, but a leadership that had taught the whole army to be afraid, leaving behind a total mess. These people were not broken by the enemy. They had simply not been managed at all. Patton's lifelong fear was only one thing: being seen as a coward. He had forged his entire tough personality as armor against that fear. Now he held in his hands 30,000 men who had been trained week after week to shrink back at any trouble. You can imagine what such a sight looked like to a man like Patton. The pressure on him was more than those 10 days. The British had little faith in American soldiers fighting. General Harold Alexander, overseeing the whole theater, wanted the Second Army placed somewhere out of the way so it would not block his trusted forces. For Patton, this army was two things at once: proof American soldiers could stand up to the Germans, and his own path back to frontline command. He had 10 days to turn the worst defeated army into one that would no longer run, and the first cut he dealt landed on their chin straps that very morning. Patton made himself the most visible person in the Second Army. Fredendall hid in the rocks 70 miles away giving orders, while Patton stood openly on the highway in a reconnaissance vehicle so every marching column could see their general moving forward, handgun with an ivory grip clearly visible at his waist. Higher-ranking officers, he insisted, should spend more time at the front. He wanted the soldiers to see that the man giving orders was closer to the enemy than they were. The inspections he made on these rounds only hardened the judgment he gave on his first morning. "A blind man can see in a minute," he said of his army. "They don't look like soldiers or act like soldiers, so why expect them to fight like soldiers?" Nothing looked right. Neckties, fastened chin straps, polished vehicles, the fine that cost a private half a month's pay. None of it was about cloth or leather. Patton used a man's appearance as a lever on what was inside him. By making a soldier stand like a soldier, dress like a soldier, salute like a soldier, maybe the soldier beneath would come back. The soldiers hated this. "The old blood and guts," they muttered behind his back. "Yeah, it's our blood and his guts." Just 4 weeks earlier they had been beaten by the Germans, and their reward was a general who fined $25 for a loose chin strap on the way to the latrine. Complaints never stopped. They just got quieter. They turned underground, because a private learned to swallow a complaint that could cost him half a month's pay. The slack in the ranks dried up. Salutes got sharper. What Patton did was crude and unforgivable. He traded one fear close at hand for another far away. The Germans were 100 miles out, but Patton was right behind them on the road watching. We like to think courage is built up by stirring speeches or great causes or flags flying. In March 1943, the hard reality of the Second Army was simpler. Patton did not make his men braver. He just made the cost of showing weakness more immediate and real than the enemy itself. Then he bet that an army trained to fear its own officers would no longer run from others. He was more than fines. On the same inspection where he caught soldiers improperly dressed, Patton noticed their terrible boots and ordered 80,000 pairs delivered by a deadline. He forced hot food into the mess halls, so men ate cooked meals instead of the cold rations they had been getting. He pushed through backlogged mail. He wrestled new equipment and clothing out of the supply system and personally took them to the front. The general who fined a private half a month's pay for a loose chin strap was, in the same week, battling the supply system to get that same private dry boots, a hot meal, and a letter from home. To Patton, these two things were not opposed. A soldier who believes his officers will leave him to rot in wet boots has no reason to obey a rule about neckties. Boots and fines were the same order, issued twice. Patton spent those 10 days burning. The British headquarters hardly believed this army deserved to be fed real combat. The overall commander Alexander gave the Americans a timid, restricted goal: retake the ground lost at Kasserine Pass, but do not touch the decisive blow held in reserve for Montgomery's Eighth Army. To Patton, this ceiling was an insult to swallow in the morning and break by afternoon. Then there was Bradley, planted by Eisenhower in his headquarters as a watchdog. Patton knew exactly why Bradley was there. He did not disobey orders. Rather, he pinned the title of deputy commander on him and kept him close, turning a watchdog into a subordinate. By mid-March, the army that could not even salute properly was moving like an army again. On the 15th of March, Patton stood in his reconnaissance vehicle and personally led his troops driving south and east toward Gabes. 3 days later, the vanguard of the force that had fled Kasserine Pass arrived at a dusty crossroads in central Tunisia, where the road from the south met the route from the coast, in a small town called Guettar. Discipline was bought in gold and silver. Within 72 hours, the Germans would come to collect the bill. The first days were almost easy. On the 17th of March, the 1st Infantry Division entered Gafsa and found the town abandoned. The Italian division defending the area had already withdrawn. The next day, William Darby's assault troops advanced with little resistance and captured the El Guettar oasis, exactly 12 days after Patton took over the army that could barely salute. 2 nights later, the troops scrambled up a sheer cliff in darkness, passing weapons hand to hand, and overran an Italian position, taking 200 prisoners. By the 22nd, Terry de la Mesa Allen's division had cleared the ridges north and south of the town and was overlooking the road to Gabes. The Italians were everywhere falling back. This rebuilt army was proven without much cost at all. Still to appear were the German army troops. On the 9th of March, Rommel had left Tunisia, handing command to Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who seemed to share the low opinion held of American soldiers after Kasserine. Von Arnim pulled the 10th Armored Division out of reserve. Under strength and battle-weary, it was the very unit that had helped crush the Second Army a month before, and sent it to drive the Americans off the El Guettar heights. The German staff expected another rout. 5 weeks of history backed up their confidence. Allen positioned Lieutenant Colonel Baker's tank destroyer battalion, the 601 Battalion with 31 gun-armed half-tracks, behind the ridges of Bu Qadada, overlooking the whole valley and the Gabes Road. He had engineers set an arc-shaped minefield across the valley floor, stretching from the southern Salt Lake across the road and up to the base of Hill 336. The minefield was laid under cover of darkness on the night of the 21st. At 6 in the morning on the 23rd, 50 tanks from the 10th Armored Division poured into the El Guettar Valley from the eastern pass, followed by motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and those long-barreled 88 guns. They formed a wide 3-sided wedge and pressed forward. At first, the Germans' expected scene seemed to unfold. American frontline infantry and artillery east of Hill 336 broke in places, with fighting at close quarters sometimes within yards. 2 German tanks got close to Allen's command post, and an officer suggested pulling the command post back. Allen's reply shocked the entire division. He would not withdraw. Whoever retreated first, he would kill. The wedge pushed into the minefield in Bu Qadada Valley. That morning the tide turned here. The German tanks hit the minefield and stopped, 8 knocked out inside. As the rest slowed down to find safe paths, artillery and tank destroyers on the ridges opened fire on the trapped armor. Baker's half-tracks charged up the ridges, fired, then withdrew to a better position and fired again. The tanks held on until they were only 100 meters from the gun positions before breaking. By 8:20, the German offensive was falling apart. By noon, the 10th Armored Division withdrew from the valley, leaving nearly 30 destroyed tanks on the valley floor and 8 dead in the minefield. The price paid on the ridge was real. The 601 Battalion lost 14 men and 21 half-tracks just to hold the line. They held. The Germans came back once more. American signals intelligence intercepted an order for another attack after 4:30. The artillery crews had their firing arcs marked and awaited the assault. When the German armor and infantry closed to 1,500 yards, divisional howitzers and 75mm guns opened timed airbursts. German artillery responded. Dive bombers flew over. None of it could shake those dug in. 2 hours later, the 10th Armored Division gave up entirely and pulled back. 5 weeks earlier, the same men had been beaten by the same armored division, abandoning equipment and fleeing 50 miles in a single retreat. On the 23rd of March, they stood on a ridge and won. The difference was not that this army suddenly found courage in 17 days. The difference was terrain, the commanding ridge, the minefield, the concentrated firepower. What Patton changed was smaller and harder than courage. He made staying in the hole less frightening than leaving the hole. These men operated under 88 guns without breaking because a half-month fine and a general always on the road taught them that the line behind them, a line they would cross if they ran, was the deadliest part of the whole battlefield. Allen, who refused to move his command post, made this clear at dawn. Danger was no longer only ahead. This was the first time since the start of the war that American soldiers faced German armor and defeated it. The front east of Guettar settled into slow stalemate. Breaking through was left to others. None of this shook what had been settled on that ridge at dawn. The British asked, did Americans have what it took to fight Germans? On the morning of the 23rd of March, that army that had fled Kasserine sent their answer back, and Patton, in just 17 days, had put that answer in their hands. 5 months later, in the hot weather of Sicily, Patton walked into a field hospital tent and ran into the opposite end of his own iron rule. It was the 3rd of August, 1943. His 7th Army was pushing toward Messina. Patton moved between wounded men at the 15th Field Hospital near Nicosia and met a private sitting on a wooden crate with no visible wounds. The man was Charles Cool, a rifleman of the 26th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment that held the Guettar Ridge in the 1st Infantry Division. The Army doctor diagnosed him with combat fatigue. Patton asked what was wrong. Cool said he had broken down. Patton slapped him across the face, grabbed his collar, and kicked him out of the tent. 2 days later, Patton issued an order to every commander in the Army. Anyone claiming nervous breakdowns was a coward and must not be admitted to hospitals. On the 10th of August, he dragged out another man. Artilleryman Paul Bennett, who said the shelling had broken his nerves, cursed him and pulled out his pistol in front of him. This was the same belief carried through to the end. The belief that had rebuilt a defeated army in 10 days. That weakness, no matter how it showed, must not exist, did not stop at the battlefield's edge. Patton refused to retreat his whole life, turning himself into armor against the fear of being called a coward. But he could not extend that tiny bit of tolerance to a terrified kid lying in a field cot, something he never once allowed himself. Was the general who fined a private for a loose chin strap, and the general who slapped a soldier for breaking down the same man, enforcing the same rule to the bitter end? Even his defenders never answered that question comfortably. Eisenhower found out what happened in the tent, privately reprimanded Patton, and forced him to apologize to those 2 soldiers, to the doctors present, and to division after division under his command. He kept the incident out of the newspapers until a radio program dragged it into the open that November. Then the nation that had cheered at Guettar began clamoring to strip Patton of his stars. When command of the army group preparing to invade France was assigned, it did not go to Patton. It went to Omar Bradley, the man Eisenhower had put into Patton's headquarters as a watchdog and promoted to deputy commander at Guettar to stay close. Patton was sidelined for several months and did not get command of the Third Army until the next spring. And to the end of his life, he was convinced that those 2 terrified privates and the hospital tents cost him the command he wanted most.